First, we're going to look at Fred here, my assistant Fred for Frederick Matthias Alexander. And I want to talk about Fred's hips here. I'm going to put his chair down for a moment. And if you can have a look here on Fred, we're going to get a profile of Fred there. I want you to really see where the lowest point of the bottom of his hips are. Can you see there where the lowest point is? It's towards the front, isn't it? It's way towards the front. Really, there's nothing back here except for soft tissue, muscles and all kinds of things and organs and stuff, but really there's no bones back here. That sacrum and the tailbone are kind of floating up in the air when I hold Fred like this. Right. And when we sit, it's kind of like this. The bottom of the sits bones, which are more towards the front, are on the chair. A lot of soft tissue back here, but not our spine and tailbone. And also there's a little bit of our thighs also on the chair, but our hip joint is in the air. Our hip joint up here is not on the chair. So that's pretty free to move. We're pretty free to move from our hip joint. So if I take Fred here and I put him in his chair and I sit him back so he's sitting on his tailbone and spine, look what happens to him. Yeah, he gets all that compression in his body. And he has to, because if he sits back like that and he doesn't have that compression, he's just going to fall backwards. So some people use the back of the chair. They can still have that compression. They don't feel it as much because they just use the back of the chair like this. But we're sitting upright and we're sitting on the bottom of our spine or our tailbone. We have to bend enough of our upper body over, enough of this weight above over to balance us, or we would just fall back. And that's one of the ways we get some of that slump in sitting. So instead, we're going to talk about how to easily sit on the front part of the bottom of the hip bones. I'm going to call it the sits bones for now. They're actually called the ischial tuberosities of the iliac bones, but we're going to call them sits bones just because we sit on them and that's a nice easy name for them. So I'm going to demonstrate this in myself with my hips. So when you sit, I'm going to put my hands in line with my hips here so you can see it a little better. When you sit, if you sit back, see my pelvis, how it tips like this? And I start sitting on the bottom of my spine on that tailbone. So just like with this skeleton, I'm starting to sit back on this, and that's really pulling my spine down. That's almost like when you have a cotton shirt that doesn't stretch or something and you're sitting on the bottom of it, how it would, if it went all the way up to the top of your neck, that would really pull you down. So we're going to just have that cotton shirt, we're going to take it and untuck it there so we're not sitting on it. So that actually what we're sitting on, instead of sitting back on the bottom of our spine, we're just going to roll forward. It actually starts with your neck releasing, letting your head just release and pop right up and your spine lengthen with it. And that'll take you right forward over the very bottom of your sits bones so that the weight is on the bottom of both sits bones, and it's also a little bit on the back of the upper part of each thigh, so you have a four-pointed sit, a very comfortable four-pointed sit. And now your butt muscles, the gluteal muscles and also your thigh muscles, they're going to feel a little flabby when you're sitting well. Even if they're really strong, they're just going to feel a little flabby because you're not holding them tight. When you hold them tight, it's like when you pull a towel tight, when it gets kind of bulked up and narrow. And when you let it be easy, it kind of flattens out. So these muscles flatten out a little bit when you're sitting well. They just kind of are free to expand and respond when you need them. But for sitting, you don't need a lot of tightening in this. In fact, that's going to tend to compress your spine if you tighten in the butt muscles. But instead, as those widen and release, then your weight goes, the bottom of those sits bones are almost at this crease where your thigh and your hip come together here. It's almost like the weight drops right in there, and then a little bit at the back part, the bottom part of your upper thigh. So you have that on either side, so you have that four-pointed sit. And you can think of that, you can even put your hands about 45 degrees in that crease and think of the weight dropping there, almost at that angle a little bit. Not quite at that 45-degree angle, but I'm saying it that way because that way, instead of pulling your abdominal muscles in, I'm going to pull my abdominal muscles in. I want you to see what happens with that. If I hold them tight and pull them in, it pulls my hips and my ribs together and down in the front. So it starts tipping my hips back like this.
Right.
And so I'm then sitting more on my tailbone and my spine instead of on the front part of my hips. Now in sitting, if you actually let the lower abdominal muscles go forward, it's a funny thing for people to do. It's a little uncomfortable. I mean, it doesn't feel uncomfortable, but it's a little odd. You feel a little awkward doing it because you think, oh no, I'm going to look like I have a big tummy, a big belly. But you end up, no matter how big your tummy is, no matter how big you are, you end up just looking like a little kid sitting compared to if you tighten those in and sit like this, then you really draw attention to this area, and then it's really stiff in your back. Because when you're sitting somewhere, if you have the lower abdominals releasing a little forward, there you go, you just try that, and then letting the weight drop right under that crease where your legs and hips come together and a little bit on the upper back of your thighs and leaving your buttocks very good and your leg muscles free. Then what happens is it's really easy for your lumbar spine to have its natural curve, but to also respond and move. If you're looking at the computer screen or you're reaching forward and you need to lean a little forward, you have all this freedom here, as well as the ability to just leave this alone and in one line and just lean forward like this if you're going to be putting your shoe on or reaching forward like that. But you also have the ability to just let this respond to any move forward with your arms. You get a lot of freedom in your whole trunk. And one of the ways you get that also are your thighs. So we just talked about the hips. And the hips, instead of tilting back like this, we're not going to purposely pull them forward. We're actually just going to release your neck so your head pops up, your spine follows it. And that's going to just roll you forward a little bit without you having to lift up. And then you can let your lower abdomen release so that your lumbar spine's free to move. And your whole back broadens also. And your thighs, instead of your leg muscles pulling in, I don't know if you can see, you can see sort of the movement of my knee when I do that, when I pull my leg muscles in. Can you see how that shortens like this?
Yes.
So instead of that shortening, I'm going to let that expand. I'm going to let that thigh just shoot out there, right through my knees. If my knee gets really long and continues out in the direction that it's pointing, it's just going to shoot out that way as I have that nice, easy balance on my hips. And that stops the tightening in the hip joint. And as we looked before at Fred at the skeleton, we noticed the hip joint is actually in the air. We're not sitting on the hip joint. We're sitting on the thigh bone, on the bottom of the hip bones, but the hip joint's in the air. So it's pretty free to have a lot of nice, easy movement in it. And then what happens is the bottom of your feet, the very bottom of your feet on the ground, end up balancing you when you're leaning one side to the other and you're moving forward or back. It's almost like they don't press into the ground with some heavy weight, but they sort of steer you away from the ground one direction or the other at the bottom of the feet, so you can leave your legs really free and your hip joint free and your head floating up and your back widening and lengthening. And then just be able to move very freely and balance the whole time you're in the chair. So when you're sitting, you're not putting pressure always on one spot and just leaving that there.
Yes.
So there's nothing wrong really with using the back of the chair. If we had one here, I could use that. But still, I would have the weight here. If there was a back on this chair, I'd still have the weight here, even as I was leaning on the back of the chair and have that little release up instead of this pull down into the back of the chair that tips my hips forward and puts the weight on the tailbone. And so to change that, I just let my neck release. My head just pops a little bit forward and up. My whole back lengthens and widens. My thighs release out so my knees direct forward of wherever they're facing. And then it's really easy to sit comfortably, to breathe easily as you sit, and to sit for a long time without strain.